A finger moved through the dust on the safe's surface, leaving a clean line in the gray. Julian's hand closed around the iron handle. He pulled. Nothing moved. He stood in the basement of his mother's house, the house he had grown up in, the house he had left 15 years ago without looking back, and stared at the safe, like a man who had just realized the door in front of him did not belong to him. He pulled the handle again. Nothing. Then he took out his phone. He had called his mother 3 times that week, 3 more times than he had called in the previous 15 years. Each time Eleanor had answered with the same unhurried voice, calm and unsurprised, as if she had known this day would come and had simply been waiting for him to arrive at it. Mom, Julian said, standing in the basement with dust on his sleeves and panic beginning to show in his breathing. "It's been 15 years. Just give me the numbers. I know what Dad left in there." Upstairs, Eleanor sat in her rocking chair by the window with her knitting in her hands. The needles moved steadily. No hesitation. No anger. Just the quiet rhythm of a woman who had learned long ago that silence could keep better records than shouting ever could. Behind her, Clara stood in the kitchen doorway, 24 years old, still watchful. She had lived in this house for 15 years, long enough to understand that the safe downstairs was not just a box of old papers. It was the place Eleanor kept what the family had refused to remember. Julian thought he could erase 15 years of absence with one phone call. He was wrong. Inside that safe was a ledger Eleanor had kept by hand. Every missed birthday, every unanswered Christmas card, every holiday Julian had spent with his new family while his first daughter waited at this house with one candle on a cake he never came to see. The code was not hidden in a bank file. It was not written in his father's will. It was not a number Julian could guess by trying old anniversaries or birthdays he still remembered. Eleanor looked up from her knitting. For the first time that morning, her eyes moved toward the small camera Clara had placed on the counter. Then Eleanor spoke. "The code is your daughter's birthday, Julian." She paused. "Do you remember which day that is?" Downstairs, Julian said nothing. Because for the first time in 15 years, the silence belonged to him. Eleanor wound the pocket watch at 7 in the morning. She did it every year on this day, the same way she did everything that mattered, with full attention and without hurry. The watch was her late husband George's, carried in his vest pocket for 30 years, and it had stopped working the winter Julian left, which Eleanor had always considered an appropriate coincidence, though she had never said so to anyone. The hands were frozen at 2:14, which was the time Julian's car had pulled out of the driveway 15 years ago, though Eleanor had not been watching the clock when it happened, and could not have said why the watch had chosen that particular time to stop. She wound it anyway, not because winding it would make it work, because winding it was the acknowledgement that time had passed and was still passing, and that the stopped hands were a record of a specific moment and records deserved to be maintained. She set the watch on the kitchen table beside her tea and sat with it for a moment. Then she put it in her cardigan pocket and went to start the morning. Clara had already made coffee. This was what Clara had done every morning for 15 years in this house, made the coffee before Eleanor came downstairs and left it where Eleanor would find it, which was an act of such consistent and unremarked care that it had become part of the structure of the mornings the way the light through the east window was part of the structure of the mornings. Clara was 24 now, a nurse at the county hospital, and she moved through the kitchen in the early morning with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned efficiency early and had decided to make it a form of love. She kissed Eleanor on the forehead on her way to the door. Eleanor said, "Take your umbrella." Clara said, "It's not going to rain." Eleanor said, "Take it anyway." Clara took it and went out, and Eleanor heard her car on the gravel, and then the lane, and then nothing. And the house settled into the particular quiet of a house that holds one person and is accustomed to doing so. Eleanor took her tea to the archive room. The archive room had been the study when George was alive, the room where he kept his papers and his books, and the organized record of a life conducted with care. After he died, Eleanor had expanded its purpose. The shelves held boxes now, each one labeled in her handwriting, each label specific. The boxes contained what they said. They contained the records of years' correspondence and receipts, and the notebooks she had kept, and the cards she had saved, organized the way an archivist organizes things, which was to say completely and without sentiment about the keeping sentiment being reserved for the things kept. She ran her hand along the shelf and found the box she was looking for, the one from the year Clara arrived, and she opened it and checked that what was inside was still in order, which it was, because Eleanor checked and things were always in order. She was reshelving the box when she heard the car. The sound of it was wrong, for the lane too smoothed the particular sound of expensive tires on gravel that was not accustomed to expensive tires. Eleanor stood in the archive room and listened to the car slow and stop, and she looked out the window. The car was a dark sedan, the kind that cost more than Eleanor's annual pension, and it sat in the driveway with the slight incongruity of an object placed in the wrong context. The door opened. A man got out. He was 52 years old, and he was dressed in the careful way of a man who dresses for situations he is uncertain about the good suit the controlled presentation. He looked at the house from the driveway with an expression Eleanor could see from the window, not precisely disdain, but something adjacent to it, the expression of someone looking at a place that is smaller than they remember and drawing conclusions from the smallness. Then he smoothed the front of his jacket with both hands and walked toward the porch. Eleanor went back to the kitchen. She sat in the rocking chair. She picked up her knitting. The knock came at the front door. Eleanor's needles moved through one complete stitch, then another, then 6 more, the rhythm unbroken, the count maintained. Outside, Julian waited. She could feel the waiting through the door, the particular quality of a man who is accustomed to doors, opening immediately and is recalibrating. After 10 full seconds, she set the knitting on the side table and stood. She walked to the front door and opened it. Julian stood on the porch looking like a man who had prepared a greeting and was waiting for the signal to deliver it. He was heavier than she remembered, which she had expected, and his hair was gray at the temples, which she had also expected, time being consistent in its applications. She looked at him. She said, "You've gained weight, Julian." Julian said, "Mom, it's me." Eleanor said, "I know who you are, Julian. I'm old, not forgetful." She stepped back from the door. Not an invitation exactly, more the opening of a space that he could choose to enter, or not the choice being his in the way that certain choices were his now and had been his for 15 years. He came in. He walked through the front hallway, and Eleanor watched him take in the house, the same house he had grown up in, the same arrangement of furniture and the same photographs on the wall, and the same smell of old wood and lavender that had been the smell of this house for 40 years. She watched him move through it the way you move through a place that was once yours and is no longer yours, with the particular displacement of someone encountering a museum of their own past. He passed the mantel. On the mantel, among the other photographs, was a photograph of Clara at her nursing school graduation, 23 years old, in her white uniform, smiling the way Clara smiled when something had been earned rather than given. Julian's eyes moved across the mantel without stopping. He did not recognize his own daughter. Eleanor noted this without expression and said nothing. She led him to the kitchen and put the kettle on, because that was what you did when someone came to the house, regardless of who they were or what they wanted or how long they had been away. 15 years was a long time to stay away. It was a very short time when you needed something. Julian looked at the pocket watch on the kitchen table. "He said you still have that." Eleanor set 2 cups of tea on the table and sat down across from him. She said, "I keep things that are broken. It reminds me they can't hurt me anymore." Julian looked at her. He opened his mouth and then closed it, which was the correct response to that particular sentence, and Eleanor noted the correctness of it without saying so. She poured the tea. Julian picked up the watch. He turned it over in his hands, the familiar weight of it, the scratched case, the hands frozen at 2:14, and Eleanor watched him hold it and saw the moment the memory arrived in him, which was the moment his hands went slightly still. 15 years collapsed in the way that time collapses when you pick up an object from a specific moment suddenly and completely, the present thinning and the past coming through. The house had been full of noise then. Julian's first wife, Maria, had died in February the year Clara was 9, and the months that followed had been the months of a house trying to find its new shape around an absence that was too large to accommodate quickly. Eleanor had been in this kitchen every day. Clara had been in this house every day on the stairs or at the kitchen table or in the yard present with the particular presence of a child who has learned to take up less space and is not entirely sure why. And Julian had been packing bags. Eleanor had come upstairs and found him in the bedroom with the suitcases open, the careful, organized packing of a man who has made a decision and is implementing it rather than the panicked packing of a man who is fleeing something which was its own information. She had stood in the doorway and said, "Where are you going?" Julian had said, "I've met someone, Cynthia. Her family is in Boston. I'm going to make a fresh start." Eleanor had looked at the suitcases. She had looked at her son, 42 years old, widowed 4 months prior, standing in his bedroom with the organized luggage of a man who had already arranged the next chapter before the current one was finished. She had said, "And Clara, Julian had said she'll be fine here with you. Cynthia's family is different. They don't need this baggage. I'll send money." Baggage. He had used that word about his 9-year-old daughter in the same tone he would have used about a piece of furniture he was not taking to the new apartment, the practical tone of a man identifying an inconvenience and resolving it. Eleanor had stood in the doorway and looked at her son and understood in the particular way that understanding sometimes arrived complete and without gradual approach, that she was seeing him clearly for the first time. She had said, "Julian, one day the past will be the only thing you want back." He had said, "I need a fresh start, Mom. Clara reminds me too much of what I've lost." He had kept packing. On the stairs, Clara sat in the shadow of the upper landing where Julian could not see her from the bedroom doorway, but Eleanor could see her from the hall, a 9-year-old girl, with her knees drawn up and her arms around them, and her face doing the thing that children's faces do when they are receiving information that is too large for them and are trying to make it smaller than it is. She had heard. Eleanor had watched her hear it and had understood that this was a moment Clara would carry in her body for the rest of her life, the specific weight of being called baggage by the person who was supposed to carry her. Eleanor had gone to the stairs and sat beside her. Clara had not said anything. Eleanor had not said anything. They had sat on the stairs together and listened to Julian's suitcases moving across the bedroom floor above them. He had come downstairs at 3 p.m. with 2 bags and his briefcase, and the smoothed-over expression of a man who has done the difficult thing and is now in the phase of moving forward. He had set the bags by the door, and he had looked at Clara on the stairs, and Clara had looked at him, and something had passed between them that Eleanor had watched without understanding its full dimensions, and has thought about many times since. He had reached into his jacket pocket and taken out the pocket watch and held it out to Eleanor. He had said, "I'll be back for the safe when I'm settled. Dad would want me to have what's in it." Eleanor had taken the watch. She had held it in her hand and looked at Julian and said nothing. He had picked up his bags and walked out the front door and down the porch steps and put his bags in the car, and Eleanor had stood on the porch holding the pocket watch with Clara's hand in hers, and the car had backed down the gravel drive and turned onto the lane, and the sound of the engine had diminished and then was gone. The watch had stopped that evening. She had wound it at dinner and heard it tick for an hour, and then it had stopped, and she had wound it again, and it had not started, and she had understood that it was finished, which felt accurate. He never sent money. He never called. He had simply proceeded into the next chapter in the way that certain people proceed, without looking back, trusting that what they left behind would manage itself, which Eleanor and Clara had done, though not in the way Julian had trusted. In the kitchen present day, Julian set the watch down. Eleanor said, "You never got settled, did you?" Julian looked at the table. He said, "It's complicated." Eleanor said, "Yes, it usually is." She picked up her tea. He hadn't left because he had to. He had left because he believed he was moving towards something better, something cleaner, a life, without the weight of what had happened. And he had not understood until now, sitting in his mother's kitchen, with his expensive suit, and his urgent need and the frozen watch between them, that you could not actually leave things behind. You could only move away from them while they stayed exactly where they were, waiting. Julian's phone rang in the hallway. Eleanor heard it from the kitchen, the ringtone, and then Julian's voice dropping to the register he used when he was trying to control something. She heard Cynthia's voice through the phone, not the words, but the tone, which was the tone of a woman accustomed to results and currently not receiving them. "Did you get it? The bank is calling." Julian said something low and affirmative, and the call ended, and he came back into the kitchen with the particular expression of a man who has just been reminded of the urgency of the thing he came here to do. He sat down. He said, "Mom, I want to do something for you. I've been thinking about it on the drive up. There's a place in Sarasota, a retirement community, completely first class, everything included. Or if you'd prefer to stay local, I could find something larger than this, closer to good medical care." Eleanor drank her tea. Julian said, "I know I've been absent. I know that's not something I can explain away, but I want to make it right, and I have the means to do that, and I'd like to start." Eleanor set her cup down. "She said you'd like to start by giving me things." Julian said, "I'd like to start somewhere." Eleanor said, "You could start by telling me why you're really here." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, a bird in the elm tree made its late morning sound and stopped. Julian looked at his hands on the table, the expensive watch on his left wrist, the manicured presentation of a man who has spent 15 years building the appearance of a certain kind of life. He said, "The business is in trouble. There are debts that have come due at the same time, and the cash position is not what it needs to be. And the bank is requiring collateral. I don't currently have liquid." He said it in the language of finance, which was the language he had learned to use for things that were easier to say in that language than in ordinary words. Eleanor listened without expression. He said, "Dad put a reserve fund in that safe. He told me about it. He said it was there for when the family needed it. Gold certificates may be bearer bonds." He said the amount was significant. Eleanor said, "Your father was a careful man." Julian said, "I know the code. He gave it to me years ago. He said the code was the day my life began." He paused. "But it doesn't work. I've tried everything. My birthday, my graduation, my wedding." Eleanor looked at him. "She said your father was a very literal man, Julian. Perhaps your definition of beginning was different from his." Julian processed this. She watched him work through the possibilities, the dates he held in his memory, the significant moments by his own accounting of his life, and she watched him arrive at the edges of the answer without crossing into it. He said, "I need that code, Mom." He said, "I'm going to lose everything, the house in Boston, the cars. Cynthia will leave if the money is gone. I know she will. She's already pulling away and I can't." He stopped. Eleanor said, "Then it sounds like you're finally about to find out what you're actually worth." She said it without cruelty. It was simply the sentence that fit the situation the way a key fits a lock, and she offered it without embellishment. Julian looked at her. Something moved in his face that she had not seen there since he was a young man, before the accumulation of decisions that had carried him away from this kitchen and this house and the people in it. Something that was not yet grief, but was in the same direction. He said, "I'm asking you as your son." Eleanor said, "You've been my son for 52 years. You were absent for 15 of them." He slid off the chair. He was on his knees on her kitchen floor in his expensive suit. And Eleanor looked at him the way you look at something that requires a response you are not sure you have, with the particular combination of pity and distance that comes from having already absorbed the worst of what a person could do to you, and having survived it, and having arrived, therefore, at a place beyond the reach of the further damage they might attempt. She did not stand. She did not reach for him. She said, "Get up, Julian." He got up. He sat back in the chair and straightened his jacket and looked at the table. She said, "I tried to open the safe once, when Clara needed money for school. I had the code your father gave me for emergencies, and it didn't work either." She paused. "He changed it before he died. He didn't tell me the new one." She looked at Julian. He left a note saying the code would reveal itself when the time was right. Julian said, "What does that mean?" Eleanor said, "It means your father had reasons for things." The front door opened. Clara came in from the hallway, still in her nurse's uniform, her bag over her shoulder, moving through the house with the ease of someone for whom this was fully and unambiguously home. She stopped at the kitchen doorway when she saw Julian at the table. Julian looked at her. A young woman, 24, dark hair, Eleanor's posture, something around the eyes that was familiar in the way of a face you have seen before and cannot place. He said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know Eleanor had company." Clara looked at him with an expression Eleanor recognized, the expression Clara used when she was deciding how much of what she felt to show, which was the expression she had learned at 9 years old on the stairs. She said, "Hello?" She walked past the kitchen doorway and down the hall to her room. Julian watched her go. He said, "Who is that?" Eleanor picked up her tea. She said, "That's someone who lives here." She said nothing more. Clara came back into the kitchen. She had changed out of her nurse's uniform and was wearing the ordinary clothes of her afternoon at home, and she moved to the counter and began making tea with the particular ease of someone navigating a familiar space, reaching for the kettle and the cups without looking the ease of 15 years of afternoons in this kitchen. Julian looked at her. He said, "I'm sorry, are you the help? Could you get us some more water?" The kitchen went very quiet. Eleanor did not correct him. She sat in her chair and held her cup and let the sentence exist in the room with its full weight, because some sentences deserved to be felt before they were addressed. Clara turned from the counter. She looked at Julian with the expression Eleanor recognized from the stairs 15 years ago, the expression Clara had developed young and had refined over the years into something that was neither anger nor hurt, but was in some ways more difficult to look at than either the complete composed attention of someone who has made peace with a situation and is now simply witnessing it. She said, "Of course." She filled a glass at the sink and carried it to the table and set it in front of Julian with the same care she brought to everything, and then she pulled out the third chair and sat down. Julian said, "Thank you." He had already looked away back to his phone, the anxiety of his situation reasserting itself over the brief social interruption. He said, "Mom, I need you to understand the timeline. The bank has given me until the end of the month. If I can access what's in the safe, I can bridge the gap and restructure. The reserve fund Dad put in there is mine by right. He told me years ago it was for the family." Clara said, "Why do you think you deserve anything from a house you haven't visited in 15 years? Julian looked up from his phone. Clara's voice had the quality, Eleanor's voice had the same unhurried delivery, the same absence of the inflection that signals anger, the statement arriving as a question that was actually an observation. Julian said, "I'm sorry." Clara said, "This house. You haven't been here in 15 years. You haven't called. You haven't sent anything. And you've come back because there's something in the basement you want?" She paused. "Why do you think you deserve it?" Julian set his phone on the table. He said, "Who are you to talk to me like that?" He said it with the particular edge of a man who is accustomed to authority in rooms and is encountering its absence. He said it to Eleanor. He said, "Who is this person?" Eleanor said, "She's the one who paid the property taxes on this house for the last 3 years, Julian. While you were settling into your fresh start." Julian looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at him with the same expression she had maintained since he arrived, the expression of a woman watching a situation unfold that she has understood for some time and is allowing to find its own shape. Julian said she paid the taxes. Eleanor said, "And the roof repairs in 2021, and the water heater in 2022. Julian looked at Clara again. He looked at her the way he had not looked at her since she came into the room, which was to say, actually looked with the full attention he had been withholding, in the way you withhold attention from people you have categorized as peripheral. He looked at her face. The eyes were his mother's color, but the shape was different. The shape was familiar in a way that didn't resolve immediately the way a word is familiar before you recall its meaning, and he sat with the familiarity for a moment looking at the young woman across the table. She looked back at him. She let him look. She did not help him arrive at the recognition, and she did not turn away from it, and she sat with the same composed patience she had been sitting with since she walked into the kitchen, and Eleanor watched Julian's face cross through the territory between not knowing and knowing. He said Clara. It came out differently from the way he had been saying words since he arrived, without the prepared quality, without the management. Just the name said, the way you say something when the processing is happening at the same time as the speaking. He said, You stayed here." Clara said, "I didn't stay, Julian. I was left. There's a difference." The kitchen held that sentence. Julian looked at the table. He looked at his hands on the table, the expensive watch, the manicured nails, the presentation of a man who had spent 15 years building a life he was now losing. And across the table his daughter sat in the chair. he had not known was her chair in the kitchen. He had not known she had been paying to keep. He said, "I didn't know you were still here." Clara said, "You didn't ask?" Eleanor watched her grandson's father, her son, sit in the kitchen of the house he had grown up in and look at the daughter he had called baggage when she was 9 years old, now 24, and entirely herself, entirely present, regarding him with the calm of someone who has already done the work of grieving a living person and has come through to the other side of it. Julian said, "I'm sorry, Clara." He said it to the table. Clara said, "I know you are." She said it the way you say something true that is not yet sufficient, the acknowledgement that sits before the larger reckoning. Eleanor stood. She said, "The safe is in the basement." "Since you're so sure of the code, Julian." She picked up the small key she kept on the shelf by the door, the key to the basement deadbolt. She said, "Let's go." She walked to the basement door. After a moment, Julian stood and followed. Clara sat at the kitchen table and looked at the glass of water she had brought him, still full, untouched, sitting exactly where she had placed it on the table, in front of a man who had not known who she was. He had come looking for a fortune in a locked box. He had not recognized the person sitting across from him, serving him water. He had looked at his daughter and seen the help. And it was only now, descending the basement stairs behind his mother, that Julian was beginning to understand what that cost him. The sheet came off the safe in a slow billow of dust that hung in the basement air and settled on Julian's suit and on the concrete floor around his feet. The safe was substantial. Eleanor had forgotten how substantial, or had not thought about it in terms of its size, for many years having thought about it instead in terms of what it contained. It was bolted to the wall the way George had bolted it when he installed it in 1998, with the seriousness of a man who understood that the things worth keeping were worth keeping securely, and it sat in the corner of the basement with the settled permanence of something that had been in one place for a long time and intended to remain. Julian stood in front of it. He reached out and put his hand on the dial. Eleanor sat on the third step from the bottom of the basement stairs, which put her slightly above the floor level, and she watched her son with the attention she had been giving him since he arrived, complete, and without the visible effort of someone who is trying to be patient, because Eleanor had long since arrived at the place where patience did not require effort. Julian said the numbers aloud as he turned the dial, the habit of a man working through a combination he had been given his birthday, first the month and day and year of his birth, the date George had told him was the code. He worked the dial with the careful attention of someone who has been told that precision matters right and left and right, and then he pulled the handle. Nothing. He reset the dial. He tried it again more slowly in case the precision had been the problem the first time. His birthday again, each number deliberate. The handle did not move. Eleanor watched him. He tried his wedding anniversary with Cynthia. The date in September 7 years ago, the wedding he had not told Eleanor about until 6 months after it occurred, the information arriving in a brief email with a photograph attached, Cynthia in white, on a lawn somewhere. Julian beside her looking like a man who had successfully completed a transaction, right. Handle. Nothing. The basement was quiet except for the sound of the dial and Julian's breathing, which had acquired the quality of breathing under pressure, slightly elevated, slightly controlled the breathing of a man who is managing something. He tried the date he had told Eleanor about once years ago in a phone call that had been warmer than most the date he had made his first significant amount of money, the milestone he had described as the moment everything changed. He had said it with the pride of someone who had arrived somewhere, and Eleanor had listened and asked questions and had not said what she was thinking, which was that the arrival he was describing was not the kind of arrival she had hoped for him. Right. Nothing. Julian stepped back from the safe. He put his hands on his hips and looked at the dial, and then looked at Eleanor on the stairs. He said none of the numbers work. He said it with the slight accusation of someone who has been given instructions that have failed. Eleanor said your father said his life began when he realized what mattered, Julian, not when he became successful. She paused. Those are not the same date. Julian looked at her. He said, then what date is it? Eleanor said, that's what you need to understand before I can tell you. He turned back to the safe. He tried his father's death date the day George had died 4 years ago, the day Eleanor had called Julian and left a message that Julian had returned 2 days later with the explanation that he had been traveling. Right, left, right. Nothing. He stood with his hand on the dial and his forehead nearly touching the cold surface of the safe, and the basement was quiet and close around him, the way basements are quiet and close, the air still and the ceiling low, and the weight of the house above pressing down in the particular way of spaces that are underground. Eleanor stood from the stairs. She crossed to the shelf along the left wall and reached behind the third box from the end and took out the ledger. It was thick, the cover worn smooth, the spine reinforced with tape that had yellowed with age. She carried it to the workbench and set it down and opened it to the first page. She said, "Sit down, Julian." He turned from the safe. He looked at the ledger. He sat on the wooden stool George had kept at the workbench for 40 years. "Eleanor said I started this the week after you left." She read. "Day 1, she said." Julian did not call. "Clara asked at breakfast if you would be coming back for her birthday. I told her I didn't know. She nodded and ate her cereal. She cried for 3 hours that afternoon in her room. She didn't know I could hear her." Julian looked at the workbench. Eleanor turned a page. "Day 47, she said. Clara's school had a father-daughter event. I called your number. It was disconnected. I took Clara to the event myself. She introduced me to her teacher as her person, not her grandmother. Her person." Eleanor turned several pages. "Day 400, she said. Clara's middle school graduation. I sent you the date 6 weeks in advance by letter because I did not have your new phone number. You did not come. You did not send a card." Clara looked at the door 3 times during the ceremony. She said she was looking for a friend. She was not looking for a friend. The basement was quiet. Julian had stopped looking at the workbench. He was looking at the ledger, at the small, neat handwriting that covered the pages in the particular hand of a woman who had been an archivist for 30 years, precise and consistent. Every entry dated, every entry recorded, with the same dispassion that Eleanor brought to the keeping of all records, which was the dispassion of someone who understood that the record was separate from the feeling that the record was what survived when the feeling became too large to carry. Day 2112, Eleanor said, "My heart surgery. Dr. Patterson said I needed someone in the waiting room." Clara took 3 days off work. She slept in the hospital chair. "I woke up and she was there. You were in Saint-Tropez. I know because Clara found a photograph on a public account. She didn't show me. I found it later." Julian said, "Mom." Eleanor said, "Day 3000. Clara paid the property taxes with her nursing salary. She didn't tell me until afterward. She said she didn't want me to feel like a burden." She closed the ledger. The basement held the weight of what she had read 5,475 days of recorded absence, the daily notation of a woman who had understood that what was not said needed to be written down somewhere, so that it existed somewhere, so that the silence had a record, even if the silence itself had no voice. Julian sat on the stool with his hands between his knees and looked at the floor. Eleanor reached into her cardigan pocket. She took out a single birthday candle, small white, the kind that comes in a box of 12 and is used once and discarded, except that this one had not been used, had been kept in a small envelope in Eleanor's pocket since that morning. She held it out to Julian. "She said today is Clara's birthday, Julian." She paused. "Did you know that?" Julian looked at the candle in his mother's hand. His hands were trembling slightly when he reached out to take it. The safe was still locked in the corner. It had not been locked to keep Julian out. It had been locked to wait for him to be man enough to face what he had done. And the dial had not moved once. Clara came down the basement stairs. She came without hurrying the way she moved through everything, with the deliberate ease of someone who has decided the pace of their own life and keeps to it regardless of the urgency in the room. She reached the bottom step and looked at Julian on the stool, and at Eleanor beside the workbench, and at the candle in Julian's trembling hand. She crossed to him. She took the candle from his hand. She reached into her pocket and took out a small lighter, the kind kept in kitchen drawers for candles and emergencies, and she lit the wick. The flame took immediately small and steady, and in the dim basement with its single overhead bulb, the candle added a warmth to the light, that the bulb did not have the particular warmth of a flame that is alive rather than powered. Clara held the candle and looked at the safe. She did not look at Julian. The safe was in the corner where it had always been. The bolt locked the dial, weighting the iron surface with its 30 years of settled existence in this basement corner. Clara looked at it the way Eleanor had always looked at it, as a thing with a specific purpose and a specific time, and the time appeared to be now. Julian stood from the stool. He said Clara. He said it the way he had said it upstairs without the management, just the name. He said, I owe you more than I can say. I know that. I know what I did, and I want to make it right. Once I get access to what's in there, I can set something up for you, an account, whatever you need, school, a house, whatever you want. Clara turned and looked at him. She made a sound. It was brief and dry, and contained within it the specific quality of a laugh that has too much sadness in it to be fully a laugh, the sound of someone encountering a statement so perfectly consistent with everything that preceded it, that the only available response was something between amusement and grief. She said, you still think money fixes things. She said it without heat. That's why you're here and we're here. Julian said, I don't know what else to offer. Clara said, I know. That's the whole problem. She looked at the candle in her hand. She said, I worked double shifts for 2 years to pay for my nursing degree. I studied at the kitchen table after Eleanor went to bed because the only quiet time was late, and the light over the table was the best light in the house. When the power went out for a week in 2019, I studied by candlelight. She paused. I took Eleanor to every appointment. I learned her medications and her allergies and the name of every doctor and the name of the neighbor who would help if I was on a night shift. She said I became a nurse partly because of Eleanor's heart surgery, and I wanted to understand what was happening, and I wanted to be able to help. She looked at Julian. Not because you taught me anything about caring for people, because Eleanor did. Julian stood in the basement with the workbench behind him and the ledger on the surface, and 15 years of recorded absence between him and his daughter, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has been given a full accounting and does not have the currency to settle it. Clara said, I don't want your money, Julian. I wanted your time, but that's the one thing you're too poor to give. The basement was quiet. Eleanor sat on the bottom stair and watched her son receive what her granddaughter had been carrying for 15 years, the specific weight of it, the accumulated days of the ledger, given human voice and human posture, and the dry, controlled grief of a young woman who had done her grieving already and was now simply stating what was true. Julian said, your grandfather. He told me the code was the day my life began. I thought he meant my birthday or my success or my marriage. Clara looked at the safe. She said Grandpa George was at the hospital the day I was born. He was the only one there, him and Eleanor, my mother's family. He held me first. He told Eleanor afterward that the moment he held me, he understood that the line would continue, that the family was not ending, that whatever came next, there would be someone to carry it forward. She paused. She said he told me that story every year on my birthday. He said the day I was born was the day his life found its continuation, the day he understood what all of it had been for. Julian looked at his daughter. Clara said he meant my birthday, Julian, not yours. Julian stood very still. Then he turned to the safe. He put his hand on the dial and he turned it to Clara's birthday, the month and the day and the year, the date that was today, the date he had not known. When Eleanor asked him in the rocking chair, the date that had been celebrated in this house every year for 24 years with a cake and a candle and 2 people who had stayed.
Right.
Left.
Right.
The sound the bolt made when it released was substantial, the sound of a heavy mechanism that had been built to hold and was now releasing a deep, clean click that filled the basement and then was gone. Julian's face moved through several things in rapid sequence. The relief, first involuntary, the physical response of a man who has been trying to open a door and has finally felt it give. Then something underneath the relief, something that arrived as the door began to swing open, and he saw what was inside that complicated and rearranged the relief into something that had no clean name. The safe was not full of gold. It was not full of bearer bonds or stacked certificates or the physical evidence of a significant reserve fund. The interior was mostly empty, the space where such things might have been occupied, instead by two items placed deliberately in the center of the lower shelf. A small dusty box, wooden, the kind used for keepsakes, and a single envelope white with a name written on the front in George's handwriting. Clara held the candle up. The flame lit the interior of the safe, the empty shelves and the two items on the lower shelf, and Julian stood before it with his hand still on the door and looked at what his father had left him. He had finally opened the door. The fortune inside looked nothing like what he had imagined. Julian took the envelope from the safe shelf. He opened it the way he did things when he was certain of what he was about to receive, with the efficiency of a man who has been waiting for something and is now finally collecting it. He pulled the document out and unfolded it, and his eyes moved across the first paragraph with the speed of someone reading for the essential information. Then his eyes stopped moving. He read the paragraph again. He said, "This can't be legal." Eleanor said it's been reviewed by 2 attorneys. It's been legal since 2009. Julian looked up from the document. He looked at Eleanor on the stair, and then at Clara with the candle, and then back at the document in his hands. He read aloud slowly, as if hearing the words in his own voice would make them mean something different than they meant on the page. He read the clause that described the condition of inheritance. George had structured the reserve fund as a conditional trust, the kind that a careful man builds when he has watched his family long enough to understand its particular vulnerabilities. The fund was Julian's fully and without restriction on the condition that Julian remained an active participant in the care and support of Eleanor and Clara. Participation defined with specificity, annual contact financial contribution proportional to capacity presence at significant events. The condition was to be evaluated at 5-year intervals by the designated trustee, who was attorney Sarah, who had been evaluating it since 2009. Julian had not met the conditions at any interval. The amendment below the original clause stated the consequence clearly in the language of a legal instrument that had been written to be unambiguous. Upon failure to meet the conditions of participation at the first evaluation period, Julian's share of the trust transferred to Clara, effective the date of her 21st birthday 3 years ago, as full and unconditional inheritance. Julian lowered the document. He said, "The fund has already transferred." Eleanor said yes. "He said 3 years ago." Eleanor said on Clara's 21st birthday. "Attorney Sarah notified me that morning. Clara was at work. I made a cake and left it on the counter for when she got home." Julian looked at Clara. Clara held the candle in one hand and his gaze in the other with equal steadiness. "He said you knew. He said it to Eleanor. You've known for 3 years that I was in debt, and you had the means to say something, and you said nothing." "Eleanor said you didn't call me to tell me you were in debt, Julian. You called me to get a code." "Julian said you let me suffer." "Eleanor said you didn't suffer, Julian." She said it with the same quality she brought to everything, the observation of someone stating a fact rather than rendering a judgment. "You lived exactly the way you chose. For 15 years you lived exactly the way you chose. Now you're living with the bill." Julian looked at the document in his hand. He looked at it the way you look at something when you are still hoping that a second reading will change what the first reading found, and then he looked up, and Clara was still there, and Eleanor was still there, and the basement was still the basement, and the document said what it said. "He said I have nothing to bring back." He said it to no one in particular, to the basement, to the safe standing open and empty behind him. "Eleanor said you have what you came with." Clara set the candle on the workbench and reached past Julian and took the small wooden box from the safe shelf. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment, and then she opened it. Inside were documents folded and old, the specific age of papers that have been kept, rather than used, preserved, rather than consulted. Land deeds, property records, the family's accumulated claim on the physical world, registered and documented and kept in a wooden box in a locked safe for 30 years by a man who understood that the things worth keeping were worth keeping securely. Clara looked at the deeds. Then she looked at Julian. She said, "You can go now." She said it without cruelty. The same way Eleanor said most things as a statement of what was true, the acknowledgement that the transaction was complete. and the next thing could begin. Julian's phone rang. It rang from his jacket pocket with the ringtone he had assigned to Cynthia, and in the basement with its concrete walls the sound was clear and present, and Julian looked down at the shape of it in his pocket, and then looked at the open safe behind him, the empty shelves, the space where the reserve fund had been and was not the interior that held nothing, now that the envelope and the box had been removed. He did not answer. The phone rang until it stopped. The basement was quiet. Julian stood with the trust amendment in one hand and his other hand at his side, and he looked at his mother on the stair and his daughter holding the box of land deeds and the open safe that had nothing left inside it. And Eleanor looked back at him with the expression she had worn since he arrived, patient and present, and 3 moves ahead the expression of a woman who had spent 15 years keeping records and had known for 3 years exactly how this afternoon would end. He came for a code to save his future. He found a document that proved he no longer had one. At least not the one he had come for. The sound of Julian's car on the gravel came through the open windows of the house, the expensive engine finding its register, and then taking it up the lane and away, the sound diminishing the way sounds diminish when they belong to someone who is leaving, which is to say, quickly and then completely. The gravel settled. The elm tree in the front yard made its late afternoon sound in the October wind. Eleanor came out to the porch with 2 cups of tea and set them on the small table between the rocking chairs and sat down. Clara came out a moment later with the absence ledger under her arm and set it on the table between the cups and sat in the other chair. They sat for a moment without speaking. The porch held the particular quality of an October afternoon that has done everything it intended to do and is now simply being the end of itself, the light going amber over the field. Across the lane, the air carrying the first serious cold of the season underneath the surface warmth. Clara said, "Should we use the money now?" She said it the way she asked Eleanor things directly, and without preamble, the tone of a young woman who has learned that the most respectful thing you can do with a question is ask it plainly. Eleanor said the money was never the point. She picked up her tea. The point was the peace. Clara looked at the ledger on the table. She said, "What do we do with this now?" Eleanor was quiet for a moment. She looked at the field across the lane, the neighbor's field that had been there as long as Eleanor had been in this house, the fence line, and the tree at the corner of it that had grown considerably in 40 years. She said, "Your grandfather was an archivist before he was anything else. He believed that the things that happened deserved to be kept, not to be used against anyone, just to be kept because what happened was real, and real things deserved a record." Clara said, "And now the record is complete." Eleanor said, "The record of the absence is complete." She paused. "But there's another record. 15 years of you here. The double shifts and the studying and the cake on the counter and the hospital chair." She looked at Clara. "That record is in here too, in between the entries about what Julian didn't do, the entries about what you did." Clara looked at the ledger with a different expression than she had been wearing all day, something softer in it, the expression of someone receiving information about themselves that they had not thought to notice. Eleanor said, "I want to turn the archive room into something real, not just boxes, a proper place, for stories like this one and others." She said there are people in this town whose stories are sitting in shoe boxes and desk drawers, and we have the space and we have the shelving, and Clara, you have your grandfather's eye for what matters. Clara looked at her. She said a real archive. Eleanor said a real one. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I think that's right." They sat with the decision the way you sit with something that has found its correct place, without needing to examine it further, the satisfaction of a right fit. Eleanor reached into her cardigan pocket. She took out the pocket watch. She held it in her palm and looked at it in the afternoon light, the worn case and the scratched crystal, and the hands frozen at 2:14, the time George's watch had stopped on the evening of the day. Julian left, which Eleanor had always understood was not a coincidence, even though she could not have explained the mechanism. She touched the crystal with one finger. She thought about the code, about what George had meant when he said the code was the day his life began. And she thought about Clara at the hospital the year she was born. George holding her first and saying to Eleanor that he understood now what it was all for. and she thought about the 15 years that had followed, and the entries in the ledger, and the cake on the counter, and the nursing degree, and the property taxes, and the hospital chair. She thought about what a beginning was. Not the day you were born into a family, the day you understood what the family was for, the day the continuation became visible, the day the work of all the previous years revealed its purpose. Clara had been that day for George, and the code had been waiting in the safe for the person who would understand, that which was Clara herself, who had known the story her whole life, because George had told it to her every year on her birthdays. Eleanor wound the watch. She wound it the way she had wound it every year on this day, with the small, steady turns of the crown, feeling the mechanism take the tension, and she held it in her palm when she finished, as she had always held it, waiting for the nothing that always followed. She heard it. A small sound, delicate and precise, the sound of a mechanism that had been stopped for 15 years and had decided in this particular late afternoon, with the amber light on the porch and the ledger closed on the table and the safe standing empty in the basement, that it was time to resume. Tick! 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 Eleanor held the watch and listened to it. Clara heard it too. She turned and looked at Eleanor's hand, and they both listened to the small, steady sound of a watch that had been broken and was no longer broken, the hands beginning their movement from 2:14 toward whatever time came next. Clara said quietly, "Is that?" Eleanor said yes. They sat on the porch and listened to the watch tick and the elm tree move in the October wind, and the field across the lane go from amber to the deeper gold of late afternoon. Clara said, "Will he come back?" Eleanor said, "Only if he runs out of money again." She paused. "But next time the door will be locked and we won't be listening." Clara looked at the watch in Eleanor's palm, the hands moving, now keeping time. She said, "What time is it showing?" Eleanor looked at the face. The hands had moved from 2:14. They were still moving, finding their way toward the correct hour. She said, "I don't know yet. It's still catching up." Clara said, "That's all right. We have time." Eleanor closed her hand gently around the watch and felt it tick against her palm. The small, living pulse of a thing that had been still for 15 years and had found its rhythm again in the right moment, which was this one, which was the afternoon after the safe was opened and the ledger was closed and the record of the absence was complete and the record of the presence was what remained. She had never raised her voice. She had never made a scene. She had kept her records and wound her watch and waited for the time that was coming, and now the time was here, and the watch was ticking, and the ledger was closed on the table between 2 cups of tea on an October porch. Silence was not weakness. It was just a long and patient breath before the truth, and the truth had finally arrived, and it had been worth every quiet year of waiting for it.